July 1st, 1946. On a day, worlds apart, in the Pacific over Bikini Island, a nuclear bomb explodes in an unparalleled display of technological might. With World War II just ended, this is the beginning of the nuclear arms race. As the world's newest superpower, the United States of America flexes its military muscle. On this same day, half a world away, on another island, in another ocean, 4,000 miles away, a different history unfolds. The people of Trinidad and Tobago are today surfacing with the first weapon of democracy, the right to vote. The age of universal adult suffrage has dawned on this British colony, bringing the vote to every man and woman 21 years and over. The old order, which had, until now, restricted the vote to persons with high income and property, has been overthrown. Also thwarted along the way was an attempt to deny the vote from those unable to prove that they understand English. Generations had come and gone without hope of ever seeing this day. And now, on July 1st, 1946, a full 108 years after emancipation, and 29 years after the end of indentureship, the people are at last finding their way into the political system. The road to universal adult suffrage had been rocky and paved with restless insurrection. Over roughly 150 years of ironclad British rule, many lives had been lost. Many activists had been beaten and broken. Many more had been jailed and punished. The stage for defiance had been set right from the beginning. Almost from that fateful day of 18th February 1797, when the British commander, Sir Ralph Abercrombie, had sailed through the Dragon's Mouth into Chaguaramas with his fleet of 18 warships and captured Trinidad from Spain. Surrendered without a fight by the Spanish governor Don José María Chacón, the multinational, multiracial composition of Trinidad immediately presented Britain with a dilemma not previously encountered in other West Indian colonies. Sizing up the large population of free mulattoes and combined majority of Spanish and French proprietors, the British government decided it could not risk handing power to an elected assembly, as had been done in Jamaica, Barbados, and initially Tobago. Especially with the triumphs of the Haitian Revolution against a humiliated France. Trinidad would prove to be a game changer for British governance of its colonial empire. In an act of political innovation, Trinidad was declared Britain's first pure crown colony, an island governed completely by royal prerogative, with an all-powerful governor on location as royal surrogate. The imposition of Crown Colony government set Trinidad's elite and the governor on a path of direct confrontation as planters and proprietors kept up their lobby for an elected assembly and a place in government. For the large majority of Trinidad's society, the dwindling number of indigenous people, the enslaved, the poor and the landless, there was no place in this political negotiation. Hopes rose briefly in 1884 when Britain restored an elected element to the Jamaican Assembly.
At one level, you had what you could describe as a middle-class opposition to Crown Colony government, which was led mainly by well-educated men of the middle stratum, typically African, Trinidadian, mixed race, and a few white Trinidadian. and they were agitating against Crown Colony government. Then you also had emergent labor unrest, which certainly you can date from emancipation onwards. And then as we come into the early 1900s, you have the beginnings of organized labor movements, the Trinidad Working Men's Association.
With the collapse of the sugar economy, the working poor joined the growing movement for reform. In 1897, the Trinidad Working Men's Association was launched as a vehicle for mobilization, agitation, and worker representation. Within 6 years, Britain's stubborn resistance to constitutional reform would trigger one of the bloodiest days in the constitutional history of Trinidad and Tobago. And it would occur right outside the seat of power, the Red House. In Trinidad and Tobago's 20th century march to self-representation, the water riots of 23rd March 1903 stands as a marker of that moment when the masses entered the political equation by storm. The authorities' plan to introduce water metering had run smack into the heated issue of taxation without representation. Water had become a combustible element as property owners, organized under the Trinidad Ratepayers Association, joined with the poor, organized under the Trinidad Working Men's Association, to confront Crown Colony government and have their say. On the morning of 23rd March 1903, as the Legislative Council opened debate on the new Waterworks Ordinance, rich and poor converged on the Red House in their thousands, marching, protesting, jeering. Soon stones began to fly, shattering the windows of the Red House. Then fire broke out, aborting the debate. By the end, the Red House was reduced to ruins, while outside in the streets, the body count stood at 16 dead and 43 wounded. In the process, incipient signs of a political leadership of the masses had emerged.
In 1903, a middle-class intelligentsia who were just as disempowered as the masses of people, the common interest manifested itself so that the people felt that, yes, these were our leaders.
The people's hero of the moment was a young black lawyer who had delivered a fiery address from Woodford Square. Born Emmanuel Lazar, he had rechristened himself Mzumbo Lazar in a bold acknowledgement of his African heritage and his position as a leader of the local Yoruba community. A member of the Pan-African Association, started by fellow Trinidadian Henry Sylvester, Mzumbo Lazar's sympathies were with those denied political representation. He campaigned relentlessly against Crown Colony government and for constitutional reform to bring elected persons into the wholly nominated Legislative Council. Immediately after the water riots, Mzumbo Lazar was charged with inciting riot, but acquitted after trial. Britain's strong-armed refusal to divest power created fertile conditions for continued resistance and defiance. In the midst of this came Britain's declaration of war on Germany as World War I broke out. Although an ocean away from the theater of war, the impact fell directly on the poor and the poorly paid masses of Trinidad and Tobago. In Port of Spain, merchants jacked up food prices from the first news of war. By the end of the war, the cost of living in Trinidad had jumped by 145%. Across the British West Indies, real wages fell by 120% over the war years.
I don't know how the young men living. They never have a shilling. I don't know how the young men living. They never have a shilling. Oh, Tommy
As the Trinidad economy plunged into a downward spiral of inflation and unemployment, the working poor and unemployed began to rumble. How ironic that this European war would provide the catalyst that would put the first nail in the coffin of Crown Colony government. Ultimately, what the lobby from above had failed to achieve, protest from below would succeed in doing.
Give to this he, the Honorable Captain Cipriani.
In Captain Arthur Andrew Cipriani, the Working Men's Association found the tactical leadership to take on Crown Colony government. Cipriani had joined the organization upon returning home from the First World War, where he had led a battalion of the British West Indies Regiment. For him, and others like Tubal Uriah Butler and T.A. Marichou of Grenada, the experience of being a West Indian fighting for Britain had been a shocking eye-opener to British racism.
They expected to fight, and they were made to do menial jobs, wash clothes, peel potatoes, that sort of thing.
At the end of their tour, the men who had left for the war as soldiers returned home as revolutionaries, more confident in their ability to organize and lead, and more bold in their willingness to challenge colonial power. In South Trinidad, where oil production was beginning to take off, asphalt workers went on strike. In Port of Spain, dock workers followed, shutting down the port. Soon the entire country was paralyzed by prolonged nationwide strikes. With labor unrest brewing throughout its West Indian colonies, Britain delivered its standard response.
Once there's a protest, once there's any kind of disturbance, we appoint a commission of inquiry, and 2 years, 3 years down the road, when the causes of that protest will have been exhausted, will have been removed, you then get a report. Long afterwards.
Appalled by what it had seen on the ground, the commission headed by E.F.L. Wood recommended a series of small steps towards constitution reform. On Saturday, 17th January 1925, Trinidad and Tobago went into its first ever election, in a case of minority vote for minority representation. Roughly 6% of the population got the right to elect 7 of the 25 members of the Legislative Council. The rest were unelected government officials and nominees of the governor, whose power was protected by a casting vote and reserve power. The vote was limited to men from the age of 21 and women from the age of 30, who met defined income and property qualifications, and who could prove they understood spoken English. But it was too little, too late.
What perhaps might have made a difference would have been a strong recommendation to support trade union development. He didn't make that recommendation. I don't think it was in his remit, but the Colonial Office clearly could have done far more in the 1920s and the early 1930s to go out of its way to support trade union development. They did not.
With over 90% of the population still locked out of the political system, the repercussions were immediate and acute.
The strikes and the rats, though I wasn't there, was the most regrettable affair. I'll now entertain you with a song. I don't know who is right or who is wrong.
The intensity of the protest in Trinidad and Tobago and in the rest of the Caribbean made them feel that we can't leave the situation as it is.
The labor riots were a genuine wake-up call. Before the labor riots, the famous scholar William Macmillan, W.M. Macmillan, had written that famous book, Warning from the West Indies, in which he had indeed warned that the desperate poverty and hopelessness and despair and anger was bound to boil over into labor rebellion.
New grassroots organizations and leaders emerged to champion the cause of workers and the poor. The most commanding was the charismatic Tubal Uriah Butler, whose militant leadership of oil workers exploded in the labor riots of 1937, before sweeping across the British West Indian colonies.
The police, they search here and there. Sergeants and majors, they tore at the hair. In kitchens, in attics, in country and town. But still the elusive Butler, he couldn't be found. Some said he had gone to America. Others said they saw him in Venezuela.
He never separated union from party. I always found that fascinating, that this guy had a kind of horse sense. You know, he used to say the right things at the right time. You may not accredit him with any great set of vision, but yet still he was able to do that. He was always able to express exactly what the people on the ground is feeling there.
Panicked by labor eruptions across its West Indian colonies, the British government dispatched yet another royal commission.
The report of the Commission of Inquiry has arrived in this colony.
So damning was the Moyne report about Britain's failures in the West Indies that with the outbreak of World War II, the Colonial Office decided to hide it for 5 years.
It showed such a frightful picture of neglect and incompetence that the British thought if it had been published at the time, it would simply have been propaganda for Germany to use against Britain and the Empire.
In this season of defiance of Crown Colony government, Calypso emerged as the medium of the masses. A medium so powerful and threatening that it was kept under tight scrutiny for sedition.
They tried to censor any kind of black nationalist literature, particularly after the emergence of Garvey. Anything that was socialist, Marxist, particularly pertaining to trade unions and radical trade unionism, those documents were also censored.
For Britain, battered and bruised by the war, and facing rebellion in its colonial ranks, the future was clear. In preparation for releasing its West Indian colonies, Jamaica was granted universal adult suffrage in 1944. 2 years later, Britain was ready to give the vote to Trinidad and Tobago. In a new round of constitutional reform, the Legislative Council was reconfigured to increase the number of elected members to 9, alongside another 9 persons appointed by the governor. With his casting vote and reserve power, the governor would retain his advantage. The question of who would now have the right to vote was a matter that the Moyne Commission felt would be better addressed by a local franchise committee. 33 of the country's most prominent persons were appointed to the franchise committee, chaired by Barrister Lennox O'Reilly. Among them were leading businessmen, trade unionists, and 4 women, including the preeminent woman of politics, Audrey Jeffers, the outstanding social activist, whose name today survives in a highway in Port of Spain.
She was part of a black elite. They owned homes in the East Dry River area and they collected rents. And they were really part of the black upper class of the time.
The discussion that followed was, in every sense, a national consultation on constitution reform. However, the Franchise Committee could not get consensus on exactly who should be allowed to vote or not.
Renzi, for example, raised an enormous agitation about that particular condition, the English language qualification. And very fortunately, the trade union movement, led at that time by Ralph Mentor, strongly supported Renzi.
In the end, the language barrier, which would eliminate a large majority of the East Indian and Patois-speaking communities, almost derailed the entire exercise.
Many leaders from that black-brown middle class, who saw themselves as the natural heirs to British colonial rule, the group that Eric Williams and the PNM, early PNM comes out of, many of them did recognize that there was a political threat from Indo-Trinidadian voters once adult suffrage was granted.
The majority on the Franchise Committee stuck to the position that the vote be given only to those who understood English. The Legislative Council upheld the position. The East Indian community, the largest group to be affected, was livid. So too the labor movement.
One of the groups that fought hardest against the language test was the organized labor movement, which was led, Rienzi certainly was there, but also prominent African Trinidadian labor leaders like Ralph Mentor, MacDonald Moses. They were members of the Franchise Committee and they fought against the language test, to their great credit, I think.
On the 27th March 1945, the Colonial Office took matters into its hands and issued an order in council giving the right to vote to everyone at age 21. There was to be no barrier of income, no barrier of property, no barrier of gender, and no barrier of language. 4 months later, on 3rd August 1945, the Legislative Council in Port of Spain adopted the order without fuss. At last, universal adult suffrage had come to Trinidad and Tobago. After almost 150 years of being denied elected representation, Trinidad and Tobago suddenly found itself on the fast track to a general election. With less than a year to go before Election Day on July 1st, 1946, an entire election architecture needed to be built. At age 91, Doreen Ahau is a member of that exclusive club of surviving voters who can lay claim to the honor of having voted in the very first election under universal adult suffrage in Trinidad and Tobago in 1946.
Yes, I did vote in the very first election in 1946 because that's when I became 21 and it was an honor somehow.
She remembers the experience as being pretty ordinary. Nothing to shout about. Most likely she came to this address at 53 Robert Street, Woodbrook. It was a private residence doubling as a polling station.
It wasn't unusual to have to go into a house. You just walked into the house, maybe there are a couple of people in the house, and I don't remember having to go behind a screen or anything like that.
With women debarred from contesting the election, the national slate was an all-male cast of 42, vying for 9 seats. In the end, roughly 53% of the electorate came out to vote.
But I think it was an excellent voter turnout. considering all the challenges. Literacy wasn't very high. You had challenges of communication. 9 electoral districts. I think it was around 703 polling stations. And considering those factors, it would have been considered a high voter turnout.
Trinidad and Tobago's historic first batch of Legislative Council members elected under Universal Adult Suffrage were Albert Gomes for North Port of Spain, Patrick Solomon for South Port of Spain, Roy Joseph for San Fernando, Chanka Miraj for St. George, Clarence Abid for Caroni, Ramjit Kumar for Victoria, Timothy Rudall for St. Patrick, Victor Bryan for the Eastern Counties, and Alfonso Filbert Theophilus James for the lone constituency of Tobago. Less than 4 months later, on October 28, 1946, the election machinery went into high gear again in yet another historic event. The first local government election ever to be held in Trinidad and Tobago under Universal Adult Suffrage. This time, the voter turnout was significantly lower at 36.8%, down by almost 20% from the general election. 110 years ago, Walsh Wrightson, the British Director of Works, whose name adorns a busy roadway in and out of the capital, had expressed the view that in the tropics, the great mass of people have not the energy, self-reliance and determination to be masters of their own destiny. Within 16 years of universal adult suffrage, the people of Trinidad and Tobago were giving the lie to Wrightson's statements. In 1962, they took on the challenge of political independence from Britain, before sealing it further in the Republican Constitution of 1976. Having consigned king and governor to history, the people have emerged over 70 years of universal adult suffrage as designers of their own destiny, with their own chosen governments accountable to them through their own independent parliament.